Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., the 8-carriage train would pull into the quiet station. Its doors would slide open with a sigh, releasing a wave of cold air and routine commuters. Among them were two people, strangers, yet familiar in an odd, silent way. Amara always sat in the third carriage window seat. She loved the way sunlight filtered through the glass, turning the train's dull interior into something almost warm. She'd slip in her earbuds, music playing softly, and pull out her sketchbook, letting the hum of the moving train drown out everything else. Across from her, always at the same hour, sat Elias. He preferred the aisle seat. Book in hand, he'd read quietly, his dark hair falling just enough to hide his face as the world passed by. He had noticed her on his very first ride months ago, a quiet figure tucked into herself, lost in her sketches. Over time, she became an anchor to his day, a reminder that life still held small beauties even when it felt monotonous. They never spoke, not once. Some days, Amara would catch glimpses of him when her hand paused mid-sketch. There was something calming about him. The steady rhythm of his breathing as he read, the subtle tilt of his lips when a line in his book amused him. She never tried to speak to him. They were strangers, after all. But the silence they shared felt more like comfort than awkwardness. Unbeknownst to her, Elias had been quietly chronicling these encounters in a small leather-bound diary he carried everywhere. He never wrote her name, he didn't know it, but he wrote about her. Day 42. She drew again today. I think it was the man standing by the coffee cart. She gets this little crease in her brow when she's focused. I like that. I wonder what she does with the sketches. Day 76. Her sweater had a tear today, a tiny hole on the cuff. She picked at it nervously for half the ride. I wished I could tell her it was barely noticeable. For Elias, writing about Amara became more than habit. It became a way to hold onto something real in a life that felt increasingly empty. And yet, he never dared approach her. After all, what would he say? Hello, I've been secretly writing about you like some lovesick teenager? One morning, something changed. The train came to an unexpected halt between stations. There was an announcement about technical issues. Passengers would have to wait. People groaned, checking their watches, pulling out phones to kill time. Amara didn't mind. She turned to a fresh page in her sketchbook and began to draw. Across from her, Elias watched as her pencil danced over paper, his curiosity eating away at his restraint. For a moment, his gaze flickered to his diary in his bag. Then he shook his head. Don't be foolish, he told himself. When the train finally jolted back to life, everything was as it should be. Almost. As the station approached and commuters stood to disembark, Amara, distracted and fumbling with her things, left something behind, her sketchbook. Elias noticed it the moment the doors slid shut. He called out instinctively, "Miss!" But it was too late. She was already gone. The sketchbook sat there, an unspoken invitation. Elias hesitated. The right thing would be to hand it to the station staff. Yet he found his fingers moving toward the book. With trembling hands, he opened it. The first page took his breath away. It was a portrait of him, seated, reading a book, hair falling over his face. Beneath it, in small, neat handwriting, were words he could barely believe. Day 42. I wonder what he's reading today. He looks peaceful. Like the world outside doesn't exist when he's in that book. I hope he never stops riding this train. Elias turned the page and the next. More drawings of him. More scribbled thoughts, observations. His crooked tie, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against the book's spine. The occasional small smile he gave to no one in particular. She had been watching him, too. For the first time in months, Elias laughed softly. A mixture of disbelief and relief. Maybe they weren't strangers after all. Elias spent the rest of the day holding onto Amara's sketchbook like it was made of glass. Precious and fragile. Each page revealed more than he could have imagined. In the quiet moments she observed him, she had been writing her thoughts, just as he had been writing his own. Day 76. He tilted his head today while reading, like the words surprised him. I wanted to ask what the book was. Would it be strange if I spoke to him? Maybe tomorrow. Elias smiled at the irony. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. That evening, as he sat at his desk with the diary in one hand and her sketchbook in the other, he realized something. I have to give it back. And I have to tell her. He wasn't sure what he'd say yet, but he couldn't let another tomorrow slip by. Elias arrived at the station earlier than usual, clutching her sketchbook tightly. The usual train arrived with its familiar sigh, and as passengers filed in, his chest tightened. What if she isn't here today? But then he saw her. Amara was in her usual seat by the window, staring down at her hands. She looked distracted, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she seemed unsettled. Her fingers played nervously with the cuff of her sweater, where a small tear had grown larger. Elias moved down the aisle, each step feeling heavier than the last. Finally, he stopped in front of her seat. Excuse me, he said softly. Amara looked up, startled. Her eyes, soft and wide, met his for the first time. She blinked, taking in the tall, awkward man standing before her, holding out something familiar. You left this, Elias said, holding out the sketchbook. Her face shifted from surprise to relief. Oh my God, she breathed, quickly reaching for it. Thank you. I thought I lost it forever. Elias hesitated as her fingers brushed the book. I didn't mean to look inside, he admitted, his voice low. But I did. Amara froze. For a second, it seemed like time itself had stopped. You looked inside? He nodded slowly, his heart pounding. I saw the sketches and what you wrote. Amara's cheeks flushed a deep red, and she looked down, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. I can explain that. Elias smiled gently. You don't have to. He reached into his bag and pulled out his own small leather-bound diary. Because I've been doing the same thing. Amara's eyes widened as she stared at the journal. You've been writing about me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded. For months. I didn't know how to talk to you. I thought, maybe it was better not to ruin whatever this was. Amara's lips curved into a small, disbelieving smile. That's exactly how I felt. The two of them laughed softly, nervous, relieved, amazed. For the first time, the silence they had shared was replaced with words that felt light and warm. Would you? Elias started, glancing down at the diary in his hands. Maybe want to grab a coffee after the ride today? Amara tilted her head, studying him, her smile growing. I think I'd like that. They sat across from each other in their usual spots. Amara flipped through her sketchbook, and Elias opened his diary. This time, however, they didn't hide behind their observations. They spoke. I didn't know you noticed the tear in my sweater, Amara teased. Elias chuckled. It's hard not to when you pick at it every day. And you read classics, huh? I always imagined it was science fiction. Classics and science fiction, Elias corrected with a grin. It depends on the day. The train hummed along its tracks, but everything felt different now. The shared silence had been replaced with laughter and curiosity, and for the first time, they saw each other clearly. Not as strangers, but as two people whose paths had finally, truly crossed. As the train approached their stop, Elias glanced at Amara and smiled. Tomorrow, he said. She smiled back. Tomorrow. But this time, they knew it wouldn't just be another day.